On her birthday, with their baby growing inside her, the billionaire served his pregnant wife divorce papers while his mistress stood behind him mocking her tears. But what neither of them knew was that she secretly owned the trillion-dollar estate company where he worked as a manager, controlling every dollar he'd ever bragged about earning. The betrayal cut deep, but deeper still was the knowledge she'd kept hidden for years, that his success, his lifestyle, his very identity as a powerful man existed only because she'd allowed it, building an empire in the shadows while he took credit for her generosity. His mother arrived with cruel words and flying luggage, determined to throw the pregnant wife out of what they all believed was her son's home, but the response would shock them into silence and bankruptcy simultaneously. One quiet phone call from the woman they'd underestimated changed everything. Accounts frozen, properties seized, executive access revoked, leaving the billionaire staring at the ruins of a life he'd never actually owned. The mistress's confident smile cracked as reality crashed down, revealing that the quiet, pregnant woman they'd humiliated held all the cards and always had, but chose this moment of ultimate betrayal to finally play them. What makes a person cruel enough to destroy their pregnant wife on her birthday? How does it feel to discover that everything you thought you controlled was actually controlled by the person you just betrayed? And when the shock of truth leaves you bankrupt and powerless, is there any path back from such devastating consequences? Dear viewers, this compelling story delivers powerful lessons about the danger of taking people for granted, the importance of genuine character over material success, and how cruelty toward loved ones creates irreversible consequences. You'll learn that quiet strength often proves more powerful than loud arrogance, that loyalty matters more than money, and that betraying someone who trusts you can cost you everything you value. This narrative will teach you about karma, justice, and why respecting your partner, especially during vulnerable times like pregnancy, defines your character. Please share in the comments the most important lessons you've learned from this story and what you would have done differently if you were in the pregnant wife situation. Would you have forgiven him, or would you have ensured he faced full consequences? Subscribe now for more engaging, entertaining, and educational stories that provide valuable life lessons wrapped in captivating drama you won't want to miss. The penthouse overlooked the city like a kingdom, but Elena Richardson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling like a prisoner in her own life. 28 candles waited on the birthday cake in the dining room, each one representing a year of existence, but only 3 of marriage to the man who no longer looked at her the way he once had. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, 5 months of pregnancy creating a life that should have brought them closer together, but instead seemed to push her husband further into the arms of someone else. "You're still standing there?" Blake's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp and dismissive in a way that would have devastated her 3 years ago, but now only confirmed what she'd suspected for months. He strode into the living room wearing the custom Tom Ford suit she'd anonymously ensured he could afford through strategic bonuses at work, his expression carrying the kind of contempt usually reserved for strangers rather than wives. "We need to talk, Elena. Now." The woman who followed him into the room wore confidence like armor, but Elena recognized every piece of her designer wardrobe because the brands were subsidiaries of companies Elena's hidden empire had invested in heavily. Vanessa Morrison, the marketing director who joined Richardson and Partners Estate Management 6 months ago, moved through the space as though she already owned it, her red-soled heels clicking against marble floors that belonged to Elena through a web of anonymous LLCs, so complex that even Blake had no idea who truly held the deed. I thought we could talk privately," Elena said quietly, her eyes moving between her husband and his mistress, searching for some sign of remorse in Blake's face, but finding only irritation that she dared to suggest privacy mattered anymore. Blake's laugh held no warmth. "Vanessa stays. She's part of this conversation now. Actually, she's part of my future, which is more than I can say for you." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, the expensive paper stock ironically purchased from a supplier Elena's corporate umbrella owned, and dropped it onto the glass coffee table between them. "Happy birthday, Elena. I'm serving you with divorce papers." The words should have shattered her, but Elena had spent 3 years learning to hide her emotions, Building an empire in secret while playing the role of docile wife to a man who thought her family money had run dry after their wedding. She'd watched him climb the corporate ladder at Richardson and Partners, a company bearing his family name, but secretly acquired by her investment firm 2 years into their marriage, never suspecting that every promotion, every bonus, every achievement he celebrated came from her invisible hand guiding his career. On my birthday, Elena's voice carried genuine hurt, but not for the reasons they assumed. She mourned not the loss of Blake. That man had disappeared long ago, but the death of who she'd hoped he might become, the father she'd wanted for their child. Blake, I'm carrying your baby, our baby. Vanessa's laughter was cruel, practiced, with the kind of mockery that revealed this moment had been rehearsed. Oh, honey, that's exactly why he's leaving now. Before you trap him completely with that pregnancy. Did you really think a man like Blake would stay with someone so ordinary? She moved closer to Blake, her hand possessively gripping his arm. He deserves someone who matches his ambition, his status, not some quiet little housewife who contributes nothing. The irony nearly made Elena break character, Vanessa calling her ordinary while standing in a penthouse Elena owned. Touching a man whose entire career Elena had orchestrated, wearing clothes from brands Elena's investments kept profitable. But she remained silent, watching them both with the kind of calm that came from holding power they couldn't begin to imagine. Sign the papers, Elena, Blake demanded, out of his tone suggesting he'd already moved past this conversation emotionally, already rewritten their history to cast himself as victim rather than villain. My lawyer structured everything fairly. You'll get a reasonable settlement, enough to start over somewhere else. The penthouse stays with me, obviously. My name's on everything that matters. His name was indeed on documents, as manager, as resident, as beneficiary of her generosity, but ownership existed in layers these people had never bothered to investigate. Elena had learned early in their marriage that Blake valued appearance over substance, that he'd rather believe himself powerful than question the convenient ease of his success, and she'd use that weakness to build something extraordinary while he took credit for her behind-the-scenes maneuvering. I need time to think, Elena said softly, playing the role they expected, while her mind calculated the cost of what came next, weighing mercy against justice and finding the scales tipping decisively toward consequences that would teach lessons nothing else could. Blake's expression hardened with impatience. You don't get time. Sign them tonight or this gets messy. Don't make me... The sound of the penthouse door opening interrupted his threat, and Elena's stomach dropped as she recognized the voice that called out, dripping with venom that had poisoned her marriage from the beginning. Patricia Richardson swept into the penthouse with the imperious energy of someone who'd never been denied anything, her designer handbag swinging from her arm as she surveyed the scene before her with obvious satisfaction. Blake's mother had made her disapproval of Elena clear from their first meeting 5 years ago, but tonight the mask of civility had been completely abandoned, replaced by naked hostility that gleamed in her cold eyes. Finally, Patricia announced, her voice carrying the kind of theatrical triumph that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment since the wedding. I told you 3 years ago this girl was wrong for you, Blake. Too quiet, too ordinary, no family connections worth mentioning. But did you listen to your mother? No. You were blinded by some misguided sense of romance. She turned her sharp gaze to Elena, to assessment turning to dismissal in seconds. I assume he's told you that this charade is finally ending? Elena felt the baby flutter inside her, a reminder of innocence caught in the crossfire of adult cruelty, and placed her hand protectively over her stomach. Mrs. Richardson, I understand you're upset, but perhaps we could discuss this privately? Your grandchild. Don't you dare try to manipulate me with that pregnancy. Patricia cut her off, venom dripping from every word as she moved closer, invading Elena's space with aggressive intent. You probably trapped my son on purpose, thinking a baby would secure your position. But Richardson men don't respond well to manipulation, dear. We have standards, expectations, legacy to consider. That child will be provided for through legal channels, but you? You're done here. Vanessa watched from her position beside Blake with barely concealed glee, occasionally whispering comments that made him smirk, their casual cruelty forming a united front against the woman they'd already dismissed as powerless. Elena observed them all with the detached calm of someone watching actors perform a play, aware of the irony that Patricia's precious Richardson legacy existed only because Elena had saved the family company from bankruptcy 2 years ago, purchasing it through shell corporations when Blake's father's mismanagement had nearly destroyed everything. "I brought these for you," Patricia said, gesturing toward the doorway where two large suitcases sat waiting. Expensive luggage that Elena recognized because she'd given them to Patricia as a Christmas gift the previous year. "Pack your things. Hey, tonight, I won't have you lingering here playing the victim, trying to guilt my son into reconsidering this necessary decision." Her smile was razor sharp. "Consider it a birthday gift. Freedom from pretending you ever belonged in our world." The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculated precision, but what struck Elena most was Blake's silence. Not disagreement, not defense of his pregnant wife, just passive acceptance of his mother's brutality, as though Elena deserved this treatment. She'd known their marriage had deteriorated, but this moment crystallized just how completely he'd erased their history, rewritten their story to justify his betrayal. "You want me to pack? Tonight? On my birthday?" Elena's voice remained steady despite the emotion churning beneath her surface. Her training in corporate negotiations serving her well in personal devastation. "Blake, you're going to let your mother throw your pregnant wife out onto the street?" Blake shifted uncomfortably, but his voice carried more irritation than guilt. "You're being dramatic, Elena. Nobody's throwing you onto the street. My mother's right. Dragging this out serves no purpose. You'll get a settlement, you'll find somewhere appropriate to live, and we'll arrange custody once the baby arrives. This doesn't have to be complicated unless you make it complicated." "Appropriate," Vanessa echoed mockingly, examining her manicured nails with exaggerated disinterest. "Maybe a nice little apartment somewhere in the suburbs? Somewhere that matches your station." The way she emphasized the last word made clear exactly how far beneath them all she considered Elena to be. Patricia grabbed the suitcases, dragging them across the marble floor with aggressive purpose, the sound echoing through the penthouse like thunder before a storm. "I'll even help you pack, dear. Make sure you only take what's actually yours. Blake has been far too generous with you over the years, buying you clothes, jewelry, maintaining this lifestyle. It's time you learn to support yourself like the independent woman you should have been all along." The comment about Blake's generosity nearly broke Elena's composure. Every piece of jewelry, every designer dress, every luxury he'd gifted her had been purchased with money she'd funneled to him through strategic bonuses and investment returns he believed were his own earned success. She'd played banker to his ego for 3 years, funding the illusion of his prosperity while he took credit for her financial acumen. "Mrs. Richardson," Elena began, but Patricia was already moving toward the bedroom, suitcases in hand, determination radiating from her rigid posture. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Blake warned, his tone carrying the kind of threat that revealed how completely he'd sided against her. "Just cooperate, sign the papers, and leave quietly, unless you want this to get ugly." Elena watched Patricia disappear into the bedroom she'd shared with Blake, heard the sound of drawers being yanked open, and felt something fundamental shift inside her, a decision crystallizing that would change everything. She'd given this man 3 years, hidden her power to protect his ego, funded his success to preserve their marriage, endured his mother's abuse to keep peace. But standing here, pregnant and humiliated on her birthday, while they treated her like garbage to be disposed of, Elena Richardson decided that mercy had limits and consequences had been postponed long enough. Her hand moved to her phone, fingers steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside her chest. And she pulled up a contact she'd never thought she'd need to call, her personal attorney, the man who managed the legal empire these people didn't know existed. "What are you doing?" Vanessa asked suspiciously, noticing Elena's phone for the first time. Elena met her gaze with a calm that came from knowing what these next few minutes would unleash. "Making a phone call," she said simply, her voice carrying a new quality that made Blake look at her with the first hint of uncertainty. "Just one call, then we'll see who's leaving tonight." The sound of Patricia throwing clothes into suitcases echoed from the bedroom, but Elena no longer heard it. Her focus had narrowed to the phone ringing in her ear and the voice that answered with professional efficiency. "Daniel," she said quietly, using the tone reserved for business decisions that required precision and left no room for negotiation. "It's time. Execute Protocol Omega. All of it. Right now." The confusion on Blake's face was immediate, but before he could question what Protocol Omega meant, Elena's phone buzzed with a confirmation text from Daniel Morris. Her attorney, the senior partner at Morris & Chen Legal Group, the firm that had structured every shell corporation, every anonymous LLC, every hidden investment that comprised her secret empire. Within seconds, her phone lit up with a cascade of notifications, each one representing another domino falling in a carefully constructed plan she'd hoped never to activate. "What protocol?" Vanessa asked, her confident smirk faltering slightly as she noticed the change in Elena's demeanor. The way her shoulders straightened, how her voice had shifted from hurt wife to something else entirely. Something that carried authority these people hadn't known existed. "Blake? What's she talking about?" Blake's phone erupted simultaneously, vibrating with such intensity he nearly dropped it, pulling it from his pocket. His face went pale as he read the screen, confusion transforming into disbelief, then dawning horror as he scrolled through message after message. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, fingers flying across his phone as he tried calling someone. But the line apparently went straight to voicemail. "This has to be a mistake. Some kind of system error." "What mistake?" Patricia emerged from the bedroom, Elena's clothes draped carelessly over her arm, irritation etched across her features at the interruption to her vindictive packing mission. "Blake, I handle your wife so we can finish this unpleasant business." But Blake wasn't listening to his mother anymore. He was staring at his phone like it had transformed into a snake, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly to name. "I've been locked out," he said, voice tight with confusion that was rapidly escalating toward panic. "Out of everything. The company email, the executive portal, the building security system. My access codes don't work. My assistant isn't answering. What the hell is happening?" Elena watched him with the detached calm of someone observing a scientific experiment, noting how quickly confidence crumbled when the foundation proved illusory, how arrogance dissolved when power shifted hands without warning. She'd spent 3 years studying these people. Blake's need for external validation, Patricia's obsession with social status, the way they both measured worth through material possessions and perceived control, and she'd built her response to target exactly those vulnerabilities. "Richardson and Partners Estate Management," Elena said quietly, her voice cutting through Blake's increasingly frantic phone calls to colleagues who apparently weren't answering. "Tell me, Blake, did you ever wonder why the company recovered so spectacularly 2 years ago, when your father's mismanagement had driven it to the brink of bankruptcy?" Blake's eyes snapped to her, suspicion mixing with confusion. "What are you talking about? My father restructured, brought in new investors." "Your father sold," Elena corrected, her tone carrying the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "When he sold 75% of the company to what he believed was a consortium of international investors. What he actually sold it to was Meridian Holdings Group, which is owned by Cascade Investment Trust, which is controlled by Apex Capital Partners, which is a subsidiary of Sterling Worldwide Enterprises." She paused, watching comprehension struggle to form on his face. "And Sterling Worldwide Enterprises is wholly owned by me." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Patricia's sharp intake of breath and Vanessa's nervous laugh that died quickly when nobody joined her. Blake stood frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand, staring at his wife as though seeing her for the first time, or perhaps realizing he'd never actually seen her at all. "That's impossible," he finally managed, but his voice carried no conviction, just desperate hope that reality might bend to his preference if he denied it firmly enough. "You don't have that kind of money. Your family, you told me your trust fund was exhausted after the wedding." "I lied," Elena said simply, the 2 words detonating like explosives in the carefully constructed narrative of their marriage. "Not about the trust fund. That was real, and it did run out. But what I never mentioned was the inheritance from my grandmother, the Richardson, my maiden name, not yours, who built a real estate empire in the 1970s and left everything to me when I turned 25, 3 months before we met." She watched his face process this information, watched the math click into place about timing and opportunity. Sterling Worldwide is worth $1.3 trillion, Blake. Near with a T. Patricia's gasp was audible now, her hand clutching at her chest as though the revelation had physical weight. You're lying. This is some kind of trick. The penthouse we're standing in? Elena continued, her voice steady despite the emotional storm she'd contained for years finally breaking free. Owned by Sterling's subsidiary Prestige Property Holdings. The Bentley you drive, Blake? Leased through Sterling's automotive division. Your executive position, your corner office, your salary that tripled mysteriously 2 years ago? She met his eyes directly, watching him understand. All of it came from me. Every promotion you thought you earned, every bonus you celebrated, every success you bragged about to your mother and your mistress. I gave you all of it. Blake's phone buzzed again. And this time, when he looked at the screen, his face went from pale to gray. I'm being summoned to an emergency board meeting, he whispered, reading the message with shaking hands. Tomorrow morning. They're talking about immediate termination, asset seizure, legal action for... He looked up sharply. Elena, what did you do? What you forced me to do, she replied, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, where their child grew, innocent of the destruction unfolding around them. Protocol Omega terminates your employment, revokes all access and privileges, freezes every account connected to Richardson and partners' benefits, initiates legal proceedings to reclaim company property in your possession, and begins the process of removing the Richardson name from the company entirely. She paused, letting each word land with full weight. You wanted a divorce, Blake. You wanted to strip me of everything and throw me out on my birthday while I'm carrying your child. So I'm granting your wish, but the only person leaving here with nothing is you. Vanessa had backed toward the door during Elena's revelation, her earlier confidence evaporating as she recalculated her position in this suddenly inverted power structure. Blake, tell her she can't do this. Get your lawyers. His lawyers. Elena's laugh held no humor. Morris & Chen Legal represents Sterling Worldwide, which means they represent me. Every legal professional Blake has access to through the company now has a conflict of interest that prevents them from helping him. He'll need to find independent counsel, which requires money he no longer has access to. She turned her attention to Patricia, who stood frozen with Elena's clothes still draped over her arms, shock rendering her temporarily speechless. And Mrs. Richardson, that trust fund you've been living off since your husband's death? Also managed by Sterling subsidiaries. I believe we'll need to review those arrangements as well, given your behavior tonight. Patricia's face transformed from shock to rage to fear in rapid succession as the implications cascaded through her understanding. You can't... This is extortion. This is consequence, Elena corrected firmly. And it's just beginning. The penthouse felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the invisible power structures that had defined every interaction for 3 years had been exposed and inverted, leaving Blake, Patricia, and Vanessa standing in a space that suddenly felt foreign and hostile to their presence. Elena watched them process their new reality, saw the exact moment each person understood that the ground beneath their feet had never been solid. Just an illusion she'd maintained through generosity they'd mistaken for weakness. Blake's phone continued its relentless buzzing, each notification another nail in the coffin of his former life. But he'd stopped looking at the screen. His eyes remained fixed on Elena, as though she'd transformed into someone unrecognizable, which in a sense she had, shedding the docile wife persona to reveal the corporate titan she'd been all along. Why? He finally asked, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, replaced by genuine confusion that almost approached the vulnerability she'd once loved in him. If you had all this power, all this money, why hide it? Why let me think I was supporting us? Why play pretend for 3 years? The question deserved an honest answer, even if honesty came too late to salvage anything between them. Elena moved to the window, looking out over the city lights that represented millions of lives, millions of stories, each person navigating their own complex relationships and power dynamics. And she wondered how many others were hiding their true selves to protect someone else's fragile ego. Because I loved you, she said simply, to the past tense, deliberate and final. When we met, you were different, kind, ambitious, but humble, someone who talked about building something meaningful rather than just accumulating status symbols. I thought if you knew about my wealth immediately, you'd never see me as Elena, just as an opportunity or a threat to your masculine identity. She turned to face him, her hand still resting on her pregnant stomach. So I hid it. I let you believe you were the provider, the successful one, the powerful partner in our marriage. I funded your career anonymously, celebrated your promotions as though they came from your merit alone, and convinced myself that our love was strong enough that the truth wouldn't matter eventually. Patricia had slowly lowered herself onto the sofa, Elena's clothes falling forgotten to the floor. Her usually sharp features slack with the kind of shock that came from having one's entire worldview shattered in minutes. All this time, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. All the times I criticized you for not contributing, for being beneath our family's standards. I owned your family's company, Elena finished quietly, without triumph or cruelty, just stating facts that needed acknowledgement. I saved it from bankruptcy, restructured its operations, turned it profitable again, and let everyone believe your son's father had orchestrated the turnaround. I paid for your lifestyle, Mrs. Richardson, your country club membership, your luxury vacations, the family money Blake kept accessing for your benefit. All of it came from sterling worldwide accounts. It filtered through enough corporate layers that you never questioned the source. Vanessa had remained silent since Elena's revelation, but now she spoke, her voice lacking its earlier mockery and carrying instead a calculating quality that revealed she was already trying to find an angle, some way to salvage advantage from the wreckage. So what happens now? You destroy Blake's career, bankrupt his mother, and then what? You think that makes you the winner here? Elena considered the question seriously because it deserves serious consideration. Revenge might feel justified, but would it actually heal anything, teach anything, change anything meaningful? She thought about the baby growing inside her, about the kind of mother she wanted to be, the kind of example she wanted to set about handling betrayal and exercising power responsibly. What happens now, Elena said slowly, working through her thoughts even as she spoke them, depends entirely on Blake's choices in the next few minutes. She turned to her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and saw something in his expression that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding, or might just be desperation masquerading as insight. I'm not interested in destroying you, Blake. Despite everything, despite the cruelty and the betrayal, you're still the father of my child, and that matters to me, even if our marriage doesn't anymore. Blake's expression shifted through hope and confusion, clearly uncertain whether this represented mercy or just a different form of punishment. Then why do all this? Why activate Protocol Omega if you're not trying to destroy me? Because you needed to understand, Elena replied, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of hidden truth finally spoken aloud. You needed to feel what it's like to have everything stripped away, to be humiliated and dismissed and treated as though you matter less than nothing. You needed to stand where I've been standing for months while you pulled away, while your mother abused me, while your mistress mocked me in my own home. She paused, letting the lesson sink in before continuing. But understanding doesn't require permanent destruction. It just requires enough pain to create change. Patricia stood suddenly, her recovery from shock transitioning into the kind of defensive anger that people default to when forced to confront their own cruelty. So this is about punishing us? About making us grovel? How noble of you, Elena. Well, how perfectly righteous. This is about consequences, Mrs. Richardson, Elena corrected, her patience for Patricia's deflection exhausted after years of enduring her contempt. You threw my luggage out. You called me ordinary, worthless, beneath your family's standards. You tried to eject your pregnant daughter-in-law onto the street on her birthday because you believed you had the power to do so without repercussion. She met Patricia's eyes steadily. I'm simply showing you what the world looks like when power sits somewhere other than where you assumed it did. Blake had been silent during this exchange, his phone now clutched in both hands as though it might anchor him to some version of reality that made sense. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality Elena hadn't heard in months. Actual humility mixed with something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. What do you want from me, Elena? Tell me what I need to do to fix this, or at least to not make it worse? The question represented an opening, and Elena had to decide in that moment what kind of person she wanted to be. Someone who wielded power as a weapon, or someone who used it to create something better than the cruelty that had been shown to her. She thought about her grandmother, the woman who'd built Sterling Worldwide from nothing and left it to Elena with one instruction. Use power to lift others when possible, but never let anyone convince you that being merciful means being weak. I want you to sign the divorce papers, Elena said firmly, because some decisions couldn't be unmade and some relationships couldn't be salvaged after trust had been so thoroughly destroyed. But I want them modified. You'll have shared custody of our child when they're born, with appropriate support provided. Not from you to me, as the original papers suggested, but from our joint responsibility as parents. You'll attend counseling, both individual and co-parenting, to address whatever drove you to betray your pregnant wife so cruelly. Blake nodded slowly, accepting these terms with the understanding that they represented extraordinary mercy given his behavior. And my job? The company? You're terminated from Richardson and Partners effective immediately, Elena stated without apology, because consequences had to mean something or they taught nothing. Nonara, but I'm not destroying your career entirely. Daniel is preparing documentation for a severance package, 6 months salary, healthcare continuation, and professional references that don't mention the circumstances of your departure. Enough to rebuild if you're willing to do the work, but not so much that you avoid feeling the impact of your choices. She turned to Patricia, who still stood rigid with defensive anger, clearly struggling to accept this dramatic reversal of fortune. Your trust fund continues, Mrs. Richardson, but with new conditions. You'll apologize, genuinely, not just to me, but to our child when they're old enough to understand what happened tonight. You'll respect custody arrangements without interference. And you'll undergo family therapy to address the toxic patterns that made you think throwing your pregnant daughter-in-law's luggage out was acceptable behavior. Patricia's mouth opened to protest, but Blake cut her off with surprising firmness. She'll agree, Mom. We both will. Because the alternative is so much worse, and we both know Elena would be completely justified in choosing that alternative instead. Vanessa had been edging toward the door during these negotiations, clearly recognizing that her position in this new reality was precarious at best. But Elena's voice stopped her before she could escape. Miss Morrison, you're terminated from Richardson and Partners as well, effective immediately. Your employment contract included morality clauses that your relationship with your married supervisor violated extensively. But unlike Blake, you won't receive severance or references, because unlike Blake, you deliberately pursued the situation with full knowledge of his marriage and my pregnancy. The cruelty Vanessa had shown earlier evaporated, replaced by panic as she calculated the professional and financial implications of termination without references in their industry. You can't do this. I'll sue for wrongful termination. You'll lose, Elena said calmly, without malice, but with absolute certainty. Daniel has documented everything. Emails, text messages, expense reports for romantic encounters on company time and company resources. You conducted an affair with your supervisor in violation of explicit company policy, and you did so while actively mocking his pregnant wife. No court will find sympathy in your position, and the publicity from trying would destroy whatever career prospects you have left. Vanessa's face crumpled, the confident mistress persona collapsing to reveal someone who'd gambled everything on a man's promises and lost spectacularly. She fled toward the door without another word, her designer heels, purchased with discounts from Sterling subsidiary brands she'd never known Elena controlled, clicking frantically across the marble in her haste to escape the wreckage of her choices. The silence that followed her departure felt heavy with unspoken realizations, and roads not taken, the kind of moment where lives diverge based on decisions that couldn't be unmade. Blake stood in the center of the penthouse that had never actually been his, holding a phone full of notifications about a career that had never actually been his achievement. And Elena saw him truly comprehend, perhaps for the first time, how completely his reality had been shaped by her invisible generosity. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words inadequate but necessary, a starting point for whatever relationship they'd need to build as co-parents, if not as spouses. For all of it, for the betrayal, the cruelty, for listening to my mother instead of protecting you, for not seeing you, really seeing you, for 3 years. His voice broke slightly. For destroying our family on your birthday, because I was too arrogant to value what I actually had. Elena felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. Not out of continued performance, but because she'd cried enough over this marriage already, and tears wouldn't change what had been broken beyond repair. "I accept your apology, Blake. Not because it fixes anything, but because our child deserves parents who can communicate civilly, who can acknowledge mistakes, and try to do better." She moved toward the bedroom, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. "Now please leave, both of you. My attorney will contact you tomorrow with the modified divorce papers and the details of your severance package. Patricia, someone from my staff will help you gather your things from the residence Blake was using." Blake nodded, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by someone who looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation of how little he'd actually controlled in his own life. Patricia followed him toward the door, her silence unusual and perhaps representing the beginning of actual reflection, not as though Elena held no illusions that one night would reform a lifetime of entitled cruelty. At the door, Blake turned back one last time. "For what it's worth, Elena, you would have made an incredible partner if I'd been smart enough to treat you like one. If I'd been secure enough to handle your success without needing to diminish it." "Yes," Elena agreed simply, because false modesty served no purpose now. "I would have. But you'll never know for certain, because you chose to see me as someone to use rather than someone to value. That's the real tragedy here, Blake. Not what I did tonight, but what you threw away before tonight ever became necessary." She closed the door on her former life, on the man she'd loved and the family she'd hoped to build, and stood in the sudden silence of her penthouse, her actual penthouse. It owned openly now rather than hidden behind corporate structures, with her hand on her stomach and her future stretching out uncertain but entirely her own. The baby kicked gently as though responding to the emotional resolution, and Elena smiled despite everything. Because whatever else had been destroyed tonight, she'd taught her child their first lesson before they were even born. That strength sometimes requires silence, but survival requires knowing when to roar. Outside, the city lights glittered like promises and warnings simultaneously. Millions of people navigating their own complex relationships, their own power dynamics, their own decisions about mercy and justice. Elena turned away from the window and moved toward tomorrow, carrying within her both a new life and a hard-won understanding that love without respect was just another form of exploitation, and that sometimes the kindest thing you could do for everyone involved was to stop protecting people from the consequences of their own cruelty. The birthday candles had long since melted on the abandoned cake, 28 flames extinguished by time and neglect. But Elena Richardson, CEO of Sterling Worldwide Enterprises, owner of a trillion-dollar empire, and soon-to-be single mother, felt strangely reborn anyway, as though this painful ending had somehow become the most important beginning of her life. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elena's private office on the 42nd floor of Sterling Worldwide's headquarters, casting golden light across the mahogany desk where she reviewed quarterly reports with one hand while the other rested on her now 8-month pregnant belly. The baby, a girl she'd learned 3 months ago, kicked vigorously against her palm, as though already eager to enter the world and claim her place in the empire her mother had built. "Mrs. Richardson, or should I say Ms. Sterling now?" Daniel Morris stood in the doorway with his characteristic blend of professionalism and genuine warmth, holding a tablet that likely contained more legal documents requiring her signature, but his expression suggested something more significant than routine paperwork. "I have updates on several matters you've been monitoring." Elena gestured him in, grateful for the distraction from financial projections that had grown increasingly difficult to focus on as her due date approached, and her mind wandered toward nursery designs and pediatrician selections instead of corporate acquisitions. Please tell me Blake hasn't violated the custody agreement terms already. The baby isn't even born yet. Actually, Blake's compliance has been exemplary, Daniel reported, settling into the chair across from her desk and pulling up files on his tablet. He's attended every counseling session, both individual and co-parenting. His therapist reports genuine progress in addressing the narcissistic tendencies and need for external validation that contributed to his behavior. He's even enrolled in a certification program for small business consulting, building a career that doesn't rely on family connections or your invisible support. The news should have brought satisfaction, but Elena felt only a complex mix of emotions she'd been processing in her own therapy sessions. Relief that her daughter would have a father capable of growth. Sadness that this growth only came after everything had been destroyed. And cautious hope that perhaps the painful lessons of that birthday night had created lasting change rather than temporary performance. And Patricia? Elena asked, though she almost dreaded the answer, knowing that Blake's mother represented a more difficult challenge than Blake himself ever had. Daniel's expression shifted to something approaching admiration. This might surprise you, but Patricia Richardson has become one of your most unexpected success stories. She's been attending family therapy religiously, and more significantly, she started volunteering at a women's shelter, specifically working with pregnant women escaping abusive relationships. Her therapist believes the shock of losing her financial security triggered genuine self-reflection about how she'd wielded power against vulnerable people. Elena felt her eyebrows rise in genuine surprise, because she'd expected compliance from Patricia, but never actual transformation. Never the kind of deep character change that suggested real growth rather than strategic adaptation. She's working with pregnant women, Patricia Richardson, who threw her pregnant daughter-in-law's luggage out 6 months ago. People are capable of change when consequences finally penetrate their defenses, Daniel observed, echoing something Elena's own therapist had told her repeatedly. Patricia lost everything she'd taken for granted: financial security, social status, her son's blind loyalty. And instead of just resenting you for it, she apparently looked in the mirror and didn't like what she saw. Her supervisor at the shelter says she's surprisingly effective because she can recognize manipulation and entitlement in the women's abusive partners, having exhibited those same patterns herself. The irony was almost poetic. Patricia Richardson, who'd embodied entitled cruelty, now helping others escape it. Elena made a mental note to verify this information independently, because trust required more than Daniel's reports. But if true, it represented the kind of redemption arc she'd hoped consequences might create, but hadn't actually expected to witness. What about Vanessa Morrison? Elena asked, completing her mental inventory of the people whose lives had been upended that night. Knowing that Vanessa represented the one person she'd offered no mercy to, no path toward redemption. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. Vanessa's been struggling significantly. Without references from Richardson and partners, she's been unable to secure comparable employment in estate management. She's currently working retail at a luxury boutique, ironically one owned by a sterling subsidiary, though she doesn't know that. She's attempted to reach out to Blake multiple times. Why? But he's blocked her completely on his therapist's recommendation. Elena felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt, but recognized it as misplaced sympathy. Vanessa had made her choices with full knowledge of their cruelty, had actively participated in humiliating a pregnant woman, and deserved to experience the natural consequences of those actions without Elena's intervention to soften them. Some people earn second chances through remorse and growth. Others simply face the reality they'd created. Let me know if she applies for any positions within Sterling companies, Elena said quietly, making a decision that surprised even herself. Not to blacklist her, I'm not interested in continuing her punishment indefinitely, but to ensure she's not placed in positions where she'd have power over vulnerable people. Honey, if she demonstrates genuine change over time, perhaps in a year or two, we can reassess. Daniel nodded approvingly, making notes on his tablet. That's remarkably merciful considering her behavior. Which brings me to the final update you've been waiting for. He swiped to a different file, and Elena recognized the logo of the charitable foundation she'd been quietly establishing over the past 6 months. The Richardson Foundation for Family Justice is fully operational. We've secured the office space, hired the executive director you interviewed last month, and begun processing applications from the first round of families seeking support. The foundation represented Elena's attempt to transform her painful experience into something meaningful. An organization that provided legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support to people trapped in marriages where power imbalances created abuse, whether emotional, financial, or otherwise. She'd funded it with $100 million from Sterling Worldwide's charitable trust, enough to help thousands of families escape situations similar to what she'd endured. Though her wealth had given her options, most people in her position would never have. "Have we received many applications?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about the scope of the problem she'd experienced personally, but never fully understood systematically. "Over 3,000 in the first month alone," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the weight of that staggering number. "The need is extraordinary, Elena. People trapped in relationships where their partners control all the finances, or where family members conspire to keep them powerless, or where they're made to feel worthless despite being the actual source of family stability and success. Your story, or at least the version we've let circulate quietly through certain networks, has inspired people to seek help who might otherwise have suffered in silence." Elena felt tears gathering, hormones and genuine emotion combining to overwhelm her usual composure, and she didn't fight them this time. Alone in her office with her trusted attorney, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of knowing that her pain had been transformed into purpose, that the cruelty she'd experienced on her birthday might prevent others from enduring similar treatment. "I want to fund it more aggressively," she said suddenly, the decision forming even as she spoke it. "Another $100 million immediately, and let's establish an endowment structure that ensures it continues indefinitely. This needs to outlive me, Daniel. This needs to be part of my daughter's inheritance. Not just the wealth, but the responsibility to use it for something beyond accumulation." Daniel smiled, the expression carrying pride in something deeper, the satisfaction of watching someone use extraordinary power with extraordinary wisdom. "I'll draft the documents immediately, though I should mention that Blake has asked to contribute to the foundation as well. Not money, he doesn't have much after 6 months of rebuilding his career, but time. He wants to volunteer, to share his perspective with other men who've exhibited similar patterns of behavior." The request stunned Elena into momentary silence, because it suggested a level of self-awareness and commitment to change that went far beyond what she dared hope for when she designed his consequences 6 months ago. Blake volunteering at a foundation, created because of his cruelty, represented either profound growth or profound manipulation, and she'd need to determine which before allowing him anywhere near vulnerable families. "Tell him I'll consider it," Elena said carefully, "but only after our daughter is born, and I've seen how he handles actual co-parenting rather than theoretical counseling. Talk is easy, Daniel. Change behavior under stress is what actually reveals character transformation." "Wise as always," Daniel agreed, standing to leave but pausing at the door with one final observation. "For what it's worth, Elena, I'm watching you navigate these past 6 months has been remarkable. You could have destroyed everyone involved that night. You had the power and arguably the justification, but instead you calibrated consequences to create opportunities for growth while protecting yourself and your daughter. That's not weakness disguised as strength. That's wisdom." After Daniel left, Elena sat alone with her thoughts and her unborn daughter, feeling the baby's movements and thinking about the world she was bringing this child into. A world where her daughter would grow up knowing her mother's full identity from the beginning, never having to hide her intelligence or capability to protect someone else's fragile ego. A world where she'd learn that power carried responsibility, that consequences should teach rather than simply punish, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was walk away from people who refuse to value you. Her phone buzzed with a message from Blake, his daily check-in that had become routine over the past month. "Hope you and baby girl are doing well today. Finished another chapter of the parenting book you recommended. Looking forward to our appointment with the pediatrician tomorrow. Thank you for giving me the chance to be a better father than I was a husband." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, weighing sincerity against performance, genuine change against strategic adaptation, and ultimately deciding that time would reveal truth in ways that analysis never could. She typed a brief response. "See you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Don't be late." 6 months ago, she'd stood in her penthouse on her birthday, a pregnant and humiliated, watching her marriage disintegrate while her husband's family and mistress celebrated her anticipated destruction. Tonight, she sat in her office at the top of a building that represented a fraction of the empire she controlled, preparing to bring her daughter into a world where that same husband attended therapy voluntarily. His mother worked to undo patterns of cruelty, and a foundation bearing their family name worked to prevent others from suffering what she'd endured. The transformation wasn't complete. Healing never moved in straight lines, and trust once shattered required years to reconstruct, if it could be reconstructed at all. But it represented something she'd never expected that terrible birthday night to create. Hope that consequences could be catalysts, that power could be used with wisdom, and that even from the ashes of betrayal, something meaningful could grow. Elena Richardson, though she'd legally reclaimed her grandmother's name and was now Elena Sterling in all official documents, placed both hands on her pregnant belly and made her daughter a silent promise that she would inherit not just wealth but values, not just power but purpose, not just her mother's empire, but her mother's hard-won understanding that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in lifting them, not in punishing cruelty indefinitely, but in creating systems that prevented it from flourishing in the first place. Outside her office windows, the city lights began flickering to life as evening descended, each light representing a life, a story, a person navigating their own complex journey through relationships and power, and the eternal question of who we choose to become when we're given the choice between revenge and redemption. Elena had made her choice 6 months ago, and every day since had proven it was the right one. Not because it was easy, not because it guaranteed happy endings, but because it allowed her to look at herself in the mirror and see someone her daughter could be proud to call mother, someone who transformed pain into purpose and wielded trillion-dollar power with wisdom her grandmother would have recognized and approved. The baby kicked again, strong and insistent, and Elena smiled despite everything, despite the complicated past, the uncertain future, other relationships still healing and others permanently broken, because this tiny person growing inside her represented the best possible epilogue to her story. New life, new beginning, new chances to get things right that her generation had gotten wrong. And as the sun set over the city her empire helped build, Elena Sterling sat in her office and felt, perhaps for the first time since that devastating birthday 6 months ago, something approaching peace. True strength isn't about destruction. It's about creating systems and opportunities that prevent others from suffering what you endured, while remaining wise enough to verify change rather than simply accepting performance.